But let's start this evening with Matthew 1 and 2, the birth of Jesus. So as a background, Christu explained to us and showed us last week how it was silent for 400 years. For 400 years, God did not speak, nor did he reveal anything to anyone. The people of God were waiting for a deliverer, a savior, and a king. These people were expecting, the last time they heard a prophet speak to them was the promise that God was going to send them someone to deliver them. And here the people are waiting for this deliverer, but it's been 400 years and they have not heard anything. The gospel according to Matthew has two specific themes that the people that Matthew is going to deal with, and especially in Matthew 1 and Matthew 2. And the first thing that Matthew had to establish was Israel's expectation for a king was one who would be a mighty ruler. So just have this in mind. When Christu last week spoke to us about the silent years, Christu made it clear and we understood that God spoke to his people got received a word and a promise that there was going to come someone to deliver them. For 400 years, God does not speak to them. There is silence. So in the people's hearts, their expectation is they are waiting for this king, this mighty ruler, this person who is going to come and deliver them. And then the second theme that Matthew is going to deal with is Herod, who was the king of that time, feared that his throne would be threatened. So the Old Testament expectation, the people from the Old Testament, so the Jews were expecting, they were thinking that dominion or this ruler that was going to come, they were thinking in a natural sense. For them to be delivered, you had to get rid of the current king in order to establish a rule. But you and I today know that this was never what God intended. God intended something much more than establishing an earthly rule. But please understand that the people did not know what to expect, especially the Jewish people, the Israelites, the people that God made a specific promise to, that he was going to send them a deliverer. Those people, in their mind, the only thing they were used to was a mighty king that fights with another king, overcomes that king, and then he becomes great. So they were thinking in a natural sense. They were not thinking, and they could not understand that God actually meant much more when he said, I am going to send you someone to deliver you. So Matthew is going to write specifically to the Jews, to the Israelites. So when we this evening, and when we read Matthew 1 and Matthew 2, I need you to understand what Matthew wants to do is specifically address the Jewish people. He is going to present Jesus to them as a king, but not as the king they are expecting. Not a king in a natural sense, but as a servant. And we'll get into this a little later this evening. Matthew starts immediately in Matthew 1 verse 1, and he says that this is a record of the ancestors of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David and Abraham. In Matthew 1 verse 1, because Matthew immediately now needs to establish Jesus as the person that is going to deliver them, he needs to now specifically speak to the Jews. Now keep in mind, what are the Jews waiting for? The Jews are waiting for someone to come and deliver them. So he immediately needs to establish the authority of Jesus. And he starts this way by saying that this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David and Abraham. Immediately he refers them to Isaiah 11 verse 1 and 2. In the Old Testament, which one of the promises, remember that the Israelites were holding on to the promises, the prophecies of God. And Isaiah, many, many years before, prophesied this, that a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge of the fear of the Lord. So again, the people were waiting for someone to come and deliver them. He immediately says, I want to tell you about Jesus, the Messiah, who is a descendant of David and Abraham. He immediately introduces Jesus as Christ. The Greek word is Christos, not Christou, Christos. And the earthly names, Jesus and Christ, is actually the earthly names of God's Son. So by saying to them, this is the genealogy of Jesus, he's saying to them, this is the genealogy of God's Son. But he doesn't use the words God's Son, he uses the words Jesus, and which actually means Christos, and to them it signifies that he wants to make a connection to something, and he gets their attention immediately. The Greek for the Hebrew word Yehoshua, which means God is salvation. So Christos, Jesus, who is also Christ, the Hebrew word for this is Jehoshua, which means God is salvation. So what is he saying? He's saying, I'm going to tell you about the God who is salvation. I'm going to tell you about the one who is also called the Messiah, the anointed one. I'm going to tell you about God's Son. So he immediately introduces Jesus in a way to the Jews that gets their attention. Immediately they realize, gee whiz, this Jesus, is he God's Son? Is he the God who is going to come and save us? Is this the anointed one? And immediately he makes that connection. But not only does he make that connection, he also needs to establish the genealogy of the man. Now, earlier the week I sent you some information and I told you we're going to learn something. Now I want you just to consider this. Matthew wants, when we think of Jesus, to realize that we are dealing with a person who came from heaven, not a God or a king who came to earth. Let me say that again. Matthew wants, when we think of Jesus, realize we are dealing with a person who came from heaven, not a God or a king who came to earth. Now here I have two images of two current kings in our world. I can't pronounce this guy's name. He's the Thai king. Can't pronounce his name. I'm not even going to try. This is King Herbert and his wife from Norway, also currently worldly kings of worldly kingdoms. There are many others. I want you quickly just stand still for a minute here, and I want to ask you, before you read the notes further, I know it's difficult, I wasn't. What I want to ask you is, a worldly king, what do you think a worldly king has? Or let me ask you this way. If you were to be the son of an earthly king, you are Prince Harry's son that was just born, or William's son that was born a while back. Tell me, if you are born into royalty, what things don't you have? What rights don't you have? I think as an earthly king, these people have everything they want. They have land. They have buildings, palaces, castles. They have money. They have nice clothes. Look at this guy on the right. Friends, I mean, his gown looks like it's made of something very expensive. And with those pink socks, it must be something really special. The point I want to make is, as an earthly king, there is nothing materially that you lack. And the people were thinking and expecting this kind of king. Someone who would come and who would be greater, who would, if the king of the time had a big palace, this guy was going to have an even bigger palace. If the current king had a lot of money and a lot of wealth, this guy was going to have more. They were thinking naturally. But I need you to understand this evening, and this is what we need to get, that you and I know today that God did not just intend for Jesus to come to earth and be wealthy. He didn't mean for Jesus to come to earth to establish this earthly kingdom. There was something else that God had in mind. So Jesus came not as a God to establish an earthly kingdom. He did not come to earth to establish, he didn't come as a king to establish, to build a big palace or a big castle. He came as a person from heaven. And this is significant. Not as a king with an intention to establish something materially. And this is where people, and this is what Matthew wanted the Israelites to understand. They were expecting a king, a savior, someone who was going to come and establish something great in the material world. Jesus, however, came as a person from heaven to establish something greater than just an earthly kingdom. Now, when we think of man, we immediately think sinful, shame. However, we must not forget these two striking affirmations, and we covered this, that we were created in God's image. Our identity are not rooted in this world, but in eternity. These two kings, I don't know them personally, but I assume that they don't maybe know much, or they don't care much for eternity. A natural king today does not care much for eternity. He cares much for what he builds and what he establishes here on earth. And the second thing that we must not forget is that when God created us, he gave us dominion. And what does this mean again? We were created to rule, friends. Even though sin derailed this fact, it remains our destiny. I want you to make a note of this evening. We were born to be kings. We were born to be rulers. But this is the thing I want you to get today. And we will later on maybe discuss this again. Born to be kings and rulers, not in a natural sense. Yes, we must rule in this world. We must have the best as the children of God. We can ask for the best as the children of God. We can expect God to be good for us. Why can I not have, I don't want a suit like this, but why can't I have one like that with pink socks? You understand? Why can't I have a nice house? Why can't I have these things? So for sure, there is nothing wrong to rule in the natural world. But friends, you and I must understand that God intended much more than just an earthly rule, and for us to be successful in the world. There's something greater. So Matthew had to prepare the people. And how does he prepare the people? He tells them, I'm going to tell you about Jesus. But then he tells them, I'm going to speak to you about Jesus Christ, who's the son of David and the son of Abraham. Now, 2 weeks ago, we stopped just before we got to Abraham in Genesis, and we're going to go back to this part. I don't want to say too much. But many, many years before Jesus' birth, God gave Abraham a promise of great land. He also told him that he would make him, give him great people and great family to live in this land. That these people that would come after him, the generations, will have a very special relationship with God. And through Abram's line, there will come a person through whom all people will be blessed. God made a covenant with Abraham. This covenant he made with Abraham is an agreement that was sealed by a blood offering. And we're not going to go into this too much, but a covenant, friends, made with God, a covenant between two people, was an agreement never intended to be broken. So this we find in Genesis 12. So God promises Abraham great land, all of these things, but listen to this, that through him, through his seed, all the people of the earth will be blessed. Later on, as we go in Abram's genealogy, we come to David. And in 2 Samuel 7 verse 8 to 17, God promises David, he also makes a covenant with David, and he promises David that David, your throne will endure and reign forever. So what does Matthew want to do? In Matthew 1 verse 1, immediately, the thing he wants to establish is this, that people of God, Jews, you are waiting for this deliverer. You are waiting for this king. I'm going to tell you about someone. I'm going to tell you about Jesus, which is Son of God, also an anointed one, also the God who has come to save you. And I'm going to show you how Jesus is a descendant of David, who is also a descendant of Abraham. And the Jewish people was at that time holding fast, they were holding on to the promise, to the covenant that God made Abraham and later to David. That Abraham, through your descendants, all people will be blessed. And David, your throne will endure and reign forever. So we are invited to see Jesus as a king and learn what dominion really involves. A person from heaven who has a right to the throne. This is what Matthew wants to establish. He then continues with the genealogy of Jesus, and he makes these connections. So the people who are waiting for this deliverer, the people who are holding on to this covenant, he shows them and he makes the connection. And then we come to verse 18, where he tells the people that, listen, you are expecting a king, you are expecting a ruler, but how he's going to come to you is not how you expected. Jesus was not coming with a message to overthrow a kingdom. He was not coming to establish an earthly kingdom. So how could this Jesus then be king? If he was not going to be fighting the king of that time, if he was not going to overthrow the kingdom of that time, how then on earth can he be the king? And Matthew had a strategy. And his strategy was to show the people that this Jesus is divine. This Jesus is not just any person. He goes on to explain in verse 18 that Mary fell pregnant. In verse 19, we read that Joseph was not going to shame her. Now remember, Mary fell pregnant, but Joseph did not go in with her. They were not intimate. So, according to the law of the Israelites that time, Joseph was supposed to publicly announce that Mary is pregnant. But he's not pregnant with him. Under the law, he was required to announce to the people and to make it known that Mary was pregnant, not with him, which means she might have fallen pregnant with someone else. So he was deciding, according to verse 19, that he was not going to shame her, but that he would rather go and divorce her in secret. But then the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said to Joseph, "No, Joseph, you are not going to divorce this woman. Mary will have a son. Call him Jesus." Not Christ, but Jesus, which again, the Greek, which is Greek for the Hebrew word Jehoshua, which means God is salvation, the Messiah, the anointed one. So friends, I want you to get this picture. Imagine this now. I want you to visualize this. The Israelites are waiting for a deliverer. That in their minds, they are waiting for a king who will come and overthrow the current system, the current kingdom. We know it's the kingdom of the Romans, as Christo last week explained to us. So they are expecting this person. But here comes Jesus, who is now this person. But in their minds, they cannot put one and one together. So Matthew needs to present to them how this Jesus, even though very simple in many ways, he is the one. And that is why Matthew then goes, and his strategy is to introduce Jesus and how he fell pregnant and what Joseph had to go through and how the angel appeared to Joseph, and he makes the connection. His strategy is to show the divine intervention of God in this whole process. 16 times in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, only in these two chapters, Matthew is establishing Jesus, or to the Jews, that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah and King. But how can this Jesus, the man who lived quietly, who raised no army, who taught and healed, who was eventually dragged unprotestingly to an agonizing death, the Jewish rabbis was asking and was going to ask, how can this man be king? Matthew had to set the tone. Jesus was a king who served. His majesty is enhanced by his suffering. The dominion intended for us would come through servanthood. So Matthew had to explain and confirm that Jesus was not going to come and fight. He was going to come and do something completely different. In Matthew 2 verse 6, he makes one of those connections. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And when he makes that quote in Matthew, it's actually referring to Micah 5, which also has that portion, out of you will come for me one who will be the ruler. He makes another connection in Matthew 2 verse 2. When the wise men comes to Jesus, they come to his parents and they say, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? And again, Matthew is referring to the prophecy in Jeremiah 23 verse 5, a king who will reign wisely. You see, he's constantly making this connection that Jesus is actually the one that you are looking for. And then he goes on by teaching the people, to helping them understand rulership through servanthood. They were expecting a king to come and take over, to overthrow, to establish this great worldly kingdom. Matthew was going to introduce Jesus as the ultimate ruler, but he was the ruler through servanthood. He does this by making a distinction between King Herod, who's the king of the time, and King Jesus. Now, this is a picture of King Herod, and as we now read in chapter 2, I'm just going to give you some background and some information about this man. So remember, King Herod, this man is currently the ruler of Judea. Now some history about this man. He fought his brothers for 10 years. He was first just a ruler. But for 10 years, he had to fight with his brothers in order to become king. So for him to become king, he had to fight his brothers. He was a man who executed his enemies and who rewarded his friends. If he liked you, he would reward you. If he didn't like you, he would just kill you or have you killed. During the battle for Rome, there were two kingdoms fighting. He gained a friendship with Augustus, who's the one that ultimately won, and he received more land. So he was a great schemer. He would befriend the good guys in order to gain more. He had 10 wives, many sons. All of these sons were scheming to gain access to his throne. He became more and more suspicious and paranoid. His own character as a schemer was reproduced in his sons. Because he was always making a plan, because he was always trying to catch someone out. This was being reproduced. He had 2 sons of his favorite wife executed. When he became 70 years old, he became sick with an incurable disease. And it's around this time that Herod, now please remember friends, this is the king currently in control. When Matthew is writing to the Israelites, when he wants to tell them and present Jesus to them, they are expecting this King Herod to be overthrown. His kingdom must be taken over. That's what they are expecting. But Matthew needs to present Jesus in a different way. This King Herod hears about the wise men seeking to worship the newborn king. He calls for them. He tells them, listen, if you find the king, please come and tell me where he is. But when they don't come back to him, he orders all the babies younger than 2 years to be killed. And this is what you read. Now, just something about these wise men. These men are called the Magi or the Magoi. This is the Greek words for these men. Now, we learn from these men the first time in Daniel 2 verse 2, when the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. So who were these wise men actually? Their number, their nationality, and their country is actually unknown. We don't know much about these men. But what we do know, their function was that they uttered prophecy, so they prophesied. They even had the gift to interpret dreams. But they did this by practicing divination, which is what? Predicting the future by studying the universe. So today we have people that look at the stars, and they can tell you when things are going to happen. They look at when the planets align or when certain things happen. They tell you that you're a Gemini or a scorpion or a snake. And because you are these things, this is the kind of person you are. So these wise men were men that were actually studying the universe. And when they one day saw this special star appear in heaven, they traced it back to an earlier prophecy that they were also that they also knew about. And they started saying, the star appeared, because remember, they are studying the stars. And all of a sudden, they see the star in the heaven. They link it back to a prophecy they've had and heard about before. And immediately they start talking. And this King Herod hears about their talking. And this is where this King Herod hears about this. He approaches these wise men and he tells these wise men, go and find this king for me. However, 5 days before his death, this King Herod has his oldest son executed. He calls the leading Jews at that time and he throws him in prison and he orders them to be killed when he dies. His dream of power and glory turned into a nightmare. He spent his last days in the splendor of a marble palace, but he lost control of his kingdom as he did of his life, and so he died. This is the king that the Israelites were under. It was not please understand, it's not a Christian king, it's not an Israelite king, it's not a Jewish king, it's the king of the time, a Roman king. And this is the guy that they are expecting that when their Messiah comes, he will overthrow this King Herod. So Matthew is very strategic. He tells us about this King Herod. Now remember, these things I told you about, the Israelites knew this about him because he was the king of the time, so they were familiar with this. So he again just tells them who is King Herod, but now he goes on to tell them about Jesus. So Herod dies in a palace, but Jesus is born in a stable. Jesus enters the world surrounded by the warmth of the animals. Jesus is born into a family so poor that according to the Bible, Mary was going to sacrifice 2 doves instead of a lamb. She didn't have money for a lamb. She only had money for 2 doves. He grows up in a very small town, very far from a seat of power. And he labored as a carpenter. Now, Christy mentioned that last week, friends. And if you ever have this opportunity, let me just say this again. We had the privilege to go to Israel. This is a picture of the house where they say Jesus lived, or the remains of the house that Jesus lived. And I tell you, or where he grew up. And I tell you, when you stand there, it's scriptures like when you read that Jesus grew up in there and there, it just brings those scriptures to life. It just gives meaning to those scriptures. If ever you have the opportunity, friends, I will encourage you to go to Israel, a wonderful, wonderful place. But please see the difference, especially with the first point. Herod is in charge of a palace. He dies in a palace, but Jesus is born in a stable. He's not yet to establish an earthly kingdom. He's yet to do something else. Jesus is 30 years old. He stands on the river bank, and he's recognized by John as the Lamb of God who would take away the sins of the world. Jesus walks the roads of Palestine. Remember, Christus last week showed us about Palestine. And it's in Palestine where he teaches and where he heals. Jesus would raise no army. He would seek no earthly glory. He would ultimately humble himself to accept death at the hands of selfish men. Through it all, he would be a king, a servant king. So friends, Matthew sets a choice before us. He's contrasting Herod and Jesus. And by doing this, Matthew asks us a question. He actually asks those Israelites a question. Do you want, remember we know that God intended for us, we were created in his image, and to have dominion, to have rule, to be kings. This is what is intended for us. Now listen. He's asking the Jews, you want dominion, right? You want to rule. Dominion in terms of outward power and splendor, or dominion through the inner core of greatness? The journey towards this inner freedom and power is what we take. Jesus is the King of Kings, and in him we take our title deed to rule. Now, friends, in finishing this evening, let me just explain to you again, for those of you who do not know or maybe have forgotten. The Bible refers to Jesus being the King of Kings. This does not compare Jesus as a king to King Herod. You and I the Israelites at that time were promised through the covenant that God made with Abraham and which he later confirmed to David. God promised that Abraham's descendants, that David's descendants would be on the throne forever. Now listen to this. People are expected, God expects of us, we were created this way, to rule and to have dominion. We must be kings. So when the Bible speaks of Jesus as the King of Kings, it does not speak of Jesus being a king of earthly kings. He speaks of Jesus as being the kings, our king. We are kings in our own right. We are supposed to rule. We are supposed to reign. We are supposed to not be controlled and influenced by this world, but we are supposed to influence this world. We should not have the lack and the fights and the things that this world has. We are kings and rulers in our own right. And Jesus, who is the ultimate king, is coming to establish his throne, not just on earth, but in the hearts of people. And Jesus did not come to establish an earthly kingdom. He came to establish an inner freedom. And this is what Matthew wanted the Israelites to grasp. That true freedom was going to come from the inside. That as they were going to accept Jesus, the one who is now the fulfillment of that promise God made to Abraham. If the Jews would accept Jesus, they would automatically become part of this kingdom who is free to rule, free to reign, free to express and to be that image of God here on earth. So friends, this evening, the birth of Jesus, Matthew's strategy was to explain and show to the Israelites that that person they have been waiting for so long, for 400 years they've been waiting, here he is. And by the birth of Jesus, one king dies, but the real king, the one who is going to come and establish the kingdom of heaven in the hearts of man, was being born. And this man, Jesus, this person who has a right to the throne, yes, he's God, but he came as a person. He had a right to the throne. And if the Jews was going to accept him, they would become part of this kingdom. So friends, that is the birth of Jesus. That is the significance. That is the connection. And I really trust that you have learned something this evening. We're going to continue to questions and answers. Again, apologies, friends, for the technical issues. We are going a couple of minutes later this evening, but it's because we started a bit late. But yes, if you have any questions, Christo, please, I'm going to ask right now that you just facilitate that for us. And then
Thank you, Pastor Jaco. All right, friends, if there's anyone that'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. And then what I'll do, I'll call out your name, and then please unmute your mic, and then you are welcome to ask the question. So any questions for Pastor Jaco? I don't see anything yet, Pastor Jaco. Right, any questions? while I wait for maybe some other questions, something that just came to mind, Pastor Jaco, when you mentioned that Mary, the mother of Jesus, only had money for 2 doves to bring as an offering. That sort of struck me as quite significant. In a sense, there's a little message in there, and I have never thought about really the significance of that until you mention it tonight. So maybe can you just say something about that? Is there a significance about those 2 doves that she brought instead of a lamb?
Yeah, Christian, I must be honest with you. I didn't look at it that way. I just know that what Mary wanted to do was she just wanted to sacrifice because it was that time of the year. But the only thing she could bring was the 2 doves. But the significance or the symbolism in that, if you have a revelation, please share it with us because I do not have.
Well, then I'm just thinking, bringing an offering, if you have a lot and you bring an offering that's not really out of your heart, it doesn't mean a lot. It's like that parable, the parable Jesus, when the lady, she only brought 2 mites, but that was almost everything that she had. Now, when you said the 2 doves is all that she could afford, I just saw this picture of, with all her heart, she did what she could. She actually brought her best. And even though her best were only 2 doves, she did what she could. So, wow. I mean, that statement actually just touched my heart. And I just wanted to highlight that. Okay, folks, anybody else that would like to ask a question, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'm not going to belabor this point. So I'll give one more opportunity. If there's anyone that would like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
There's nothing in the chat box either at the moment, Christo.
Okay, I don't see anything. So Pastor Jaco, I think back to you. You covered it very well. I learned a few things tonight. So back to you. There's no questions then.
Thank you, Christo, Alwyn. So friends, then finally, just to what to look forward to next week. And this would be the topic on Jesus's preparation. So he is born, we know, for a specific task. He's not just going to come to establish a worldly kingdom. He is going to come and establish a heavenly kingdom in this world. We're going to encourage you to please go and read Matthew 3-4. And let's discover and learn again how Jesus was prepared for this great and awesome work that God planned for him to undertake. So thank you very much for your time this evening.